Alright, Teen Vogue, a publication that I forgot existed, but apparently it's pretty popular with 3.3 million followers on Twitter. Pretty impressive. Well, they published this article, which I found to be, well, ridiculous. It's called Everything You Should Know About Karl Marx, and I read the entire article. It's not that long. And it seemed to fail on mentioning one thing that I think people, especially teenagers who will go through high school not being taught a thing about the many attempts at ushering in the utopia using Marx as the foundation. There is one thing this article never mentions, that being the untold millions of people that died under regimes that used Marx as its foundation for the revolution and for the solidarity of the workers of the world and the pushback against capitalist exploitation, all that wonderful stuff. It never even mentions that, hey, it seems like if you begin a movement that really takes this stuff seriously, despite supposedly fighting for liberation from the chains that bind you and all that, it seems it has a 100% failure rate, and it's not a trivial failure that you can just dust yourself off from. It's a colossal failure that leaves mangled and emaciated corpses in its wake. Marx is a complex character. There's a lot you can say about him. But in an article titled Everything You Should Know About Karl Marx, I would think that the body count his ideology leaves behind should be mentioned somewhere. Even if you mention it and try and explain it away, at least do that. Although this article does talk about the violence in Marxism, it sort of downplays it and does it in kind of a glowing manner. It draws from a former professor from Drexel University, George Ciccarello, and in it he says, "I do a little role-playing with my class. I tell them I'm the boss, you're my workers, and you want to try and take me down. I have the money, I own the factory, I control the police, I control the military, I control the government. What do you guys have?" And he says that it's usually one student who says, "We outnumber you." So that's great. That's a great lesson. If you outnumber someone, just take what you want by force and violence. And obviously, of course, I'm sure that this professor never mentions the fact that your employer in this situation is likely the one that outlaid all the capital, took on an insurmountable amount of risk that you as the worker don't need to take on. He probably doesn't mention the time value of money. You as a worker get paid on time no matter what, whereas the employer probably didn't get paid for a long time at the beginning of their venture and has no guarantee of payment if society at large doesn't want what they're offering. He probably also doesn't mention that when you labor, if the product doesn't sell, you don't take a hit. You get paid no matter what, whereas the employer could take a huge hit, and if it's bad enough, they go out of business. Now, you as the worker would need to find another job. That's true, and that's a bummer, no doubt, but the employer is now in a huge hole that God only knows how long it would take them to dig out of. You as the laborer don't have to worry about that hole, you get to walk away from it. These are just a few details I'm sure this professor leaves out, and admittedly, that's a guess on my part. But also, going back to his quote, if this so-called private business owner owns the police, owns the military, and has control of the government, they're not really private in any real sense, are they? Because throughout this article, slavery and the forced annexation of land is mentioned as the foundation of capitalism. These are mentioned, but it never even hints at the fact that all of this was done or made possible by government, which is not the private ownership of anything. It is the public, collectivized sector. So instead of saying, hey, what's the common denominator in all of these tragedies that have occurred throughout history? That common denominator is, of course, the government, which is antithetical to private ownership, as its forced, violent collectivization of wealth. So instead of teaching these kids to think about the poisonous root that is the cause of all these problems, that being the government, instead they're taught that if you don't like your boss, remember that you've got the numbers, so just jack them up and become a violent force of collectivized drones. It's been tried innumerable times and always ends in utter bloodshed, mayhem, and suffering for nearly everyone, except for those who have the charisma and violent tendencies to get a hold of government power. That is an astronomically significant factor in all of this that this article does not mention. And not just this article, Marxists at large just barely ever mention this, and if they do, they just say, yeah, it was private companies that got a hold of all that power, so let's just lay the blame at the feet of all the private enterprises. It's ridiculous. Because here's the thing, I don't deny that a private business that exists today could not get into bed and collude with government tomorrow to unfairly rig the game for its own self-interest. That happens, no doubt. But you only make things infinitely worse by destroying the private sector while you ignore the real, actual culprit, which is the power that has been consolidated in the public, collectivized sector. And oddly enough, Marxists advocate specifically for more public power. They say they don't like the government, but then they behave just as the government behaves. And they advocate for more people behaving just as the government behaves, which is essentially disregard everyone's natural rights and behave like a bunch of people who have the right to do whatever they want. Because in their mind, might makes right. If we got the numbers and we got the power, we're going to behave just as the violent government that we criticize behaves, but we're going to somehow declare that we're somehow different. The whole thing is just ridiculous, and I hope this ridiculously stupid article doesn't warp the minds of some teenager. But anyway, that's all for now. Like, subscribe, share. Don't be violent just because you got the numbers, because it always backfires. And take it easy.